just going to offer two general commentaries with a sort of invitation to extend things that you may have already touched on to start with. And if you like them, you can pick up on them. And if not, I will have other things to say. One thing I think is really powerful about hearing these three presentations together is that they offer some new ways that we might start to think about invasiveness as something that crosses species lines, right, and creates outcomes and events that impact not just humans or non-human life in separate ways, but in some fashion are tied together in a political ecology that is political and ecological sort of all the way through. And they pointed very clearly to me to invasiveness as in relation to a series of oppositions. And I think some of those oppositions are politically difficult or troubling, right? So in the opposition of invasiveness to nativeness or to purity. And this is, I think, frequently invoked when invasiveness is discussed in an ecological setting, right? And so in different ways, all three of you touched on that trouble. And that is, in a debt, in a way, to ecology's own language of invasiveness and nativeness, right? And in a sense that we sort of picked up on and have returned. But I think you all also raised other oppositions or other antonyms of invasion or invade. And I think those open actually a wider range of possibilities than that sort of fixation on invasive and native would actually allow. So I wanted to sort of ask you if you wanted to either expand on your own sense of that or on the ideas of others. And that might invoke any one of a number of other meanings. One opposite of invade might well be to aid or to assist. A second one might be to help or to protect. And a third one that I'm not sure any of the three of you picked up might be to leave alone, right? So the opposite of to invade could well be to leave alone rather than to enmesh or embroil further. So that's just one, I think, quite sort of general question about if we're here to think about invasive others and invasiveness more broadly, in what way are we thinking about, in opposition to what sets of terms are we thinking about that, and what's at stake in trying to use one set rather than another? And then a second sort of general question I have for the panel has to do, well, it starts, I guess, from the description of the panel as having a focus on the common language of invasion, right, and the sort of discourses of invasion. And in many ways, you've all spoken about, right, the ways that humans are speaking about invasiveness as very central to your accounts in different ways. And what I find interesting about this is the way that that linguistic emphasis, on the one hand, allows us to see the common threads across these rhetorics of invasive species and invasive humans, right? But on the other hand, it also redivides them by putting a very strong emphasis on human language as the thing that's sort of doing the work here. And that kind of linguistic competence is frequently something that we say non-human species don't have, right? Human language is something that, well, we think most humans have, and even there, that's a questionable assumption politically, the way it's played out in terms of who can speak, right? Who is linguistically competent and in what ways. And so something I'm really interested in is how helpful do you find language as the sole sort of common thread to draw these different kinds of invasivenesses? Is that a word? The plural of invasiveness? To draw these different kinds of invasivenesses together. Or to what extent could we extend or more explicitly be attentive to other concepts and practices around invasion that might help us think about the ecology's side of this, right, very directly. And you've gestured to this already in different ways, but if you'd like to go further on that, that would be wonderful. I'll throw it to whoever wants to jump in.
All right. I'll look at that from my research point of view. I think. Now it's on. Okay. The concept of invasiveness, it is both, as I was saying, physical but linguistic, so metaphorical in a way. And I think this sort of sense, it's based on a general sort of division, separation between the here and there. In a way, we think that metaphors originate from very physical experiences. The issue is, of course, that already talking about the here and there, becomes a linguistic move that separates realities. So I think that's the beginning of the complication. In terms of food, that is what I've focused on, think about the difference between the local and the global. For instance, it's a very important separation when we talk about food and food politics. But in reality, if we look at how things developed, there is no local without the global, and vice versa. I mean, we've been globalized since the start, and at the same time, now the local is able to acquire value because there is a global. So now the global is perceived as invasive, while in reality has been foundational to define the reality in which we live. I don't know, one example that I like to quote quite often in my country, in Italy, there is a political party that is really against not only immigration, but also people from the south. You know, Florence down, you're another species. We are Celts, you guys are descendants of the Latin. So they superimpose all sorts of weird structures on this. And at a certain point, they decided to use food to point out the attacks, the invasiveness of globalization. So they put out posters that said, yes to polenta, not to couscous, right? And they organized sort of performances, demonstrations where people were fed polenta, cooked in a specific way with specific ingredients, without realizing that polenta is not originally from there. You know, it's been in Italy only from the 16th century. I mean, if you want to get picky, couscous has been in Italy for much longer because of the Arabs and all that. But the way that discourse is created, the local, created by globalization, really makes you think about how sort of a linguistic, metaphorical operation then becomes operational when you start discussing very real political issues.
I liked your framing actually because in a way I think that the sort of binaries or the provocations that you presented about aid, assistance, protection, et cetera, that actually I think is sort of the other side of the invasive other, right? It's kind of like, and so I was thinking like, you know, what if the conference were called, you know, the invading selves or something like that, you know, because I think that we're sort of, it invites a binary thinking in a way. So that's why, you know, I'm sort of interested in, and it was really only because of the conference that I started thinking about this, so thanks for that. But, you know, thinking about hospitality and the ways in which host-guest relations kind of, you know, so I use that Michel Serres quote, not because I really understand what he writes about exactly, but because he complicates the particular relation between host and guest and says, you know, they're basically the same. So I think that, you know, for me thinking about, you know, I've been parallel to how I've been thinking through the paper I just presented, but my work in general has been questions about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics. So I think that, you know, and this came out very clearly, especially in the papers about the refugee crisis, and in Bridget's paper yesterday, you know, Europe and many other nations are facing the impossibility of true cosmopolitanism or sort of unconditional cosmopolitanism. So I think, you know, looking very closely and empirically at how these, you know, how the boundaries are drawn and how the relations are actually worked out, because, you know, like the discourse of we can't take them all, right? That's kind of the limit of liberal humanism and cosmopolitanism. So then what? Like then what do people do? So that's sort of how I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been interested for excuse me. I've been interested for a long time in this movement of language between biology and the social. I mean, in many ways. I mean, you see this. Yes, sorry. You know, I've been as I was saying, I've been interested for a long time in this movement in language, between biology and the social, in the ways that biologists, for instance, are almost, well, I'm trying to think. There's this, well, okay, let me put it like this. For any of you who I don't know if there are people here who read a lot in biology, in biological texts, or in ecology, or even in conservation, or, but I'm sure you know that so many terms are just derived directly or taken directly from social terms. So not just things like invasion and aliens and these kinds of things which we're talking about today, but even forms which will just describe social behavior are drawn directly. So like in insects, for instance, that I've spent some time thinking about, for instance, if you want to think about bees, then the whole form of social structure of bees is drawn from models of sort of, I guess, a form of 19th century anthropology, actually, where you have tribes, you have castes, you have all these kinds of things, races, all these kinds of things, and then they're applied in a way, they travel in a way that both separates them from their social context, but also just directly takes that form and sort of reproduces a sort of understood, a sort of commonsensical form into this well, as an explanatory form, not just as a descriptive form for social behavior in the animals. And then at the same time, then at a certain point, it also then gets fed back. I mean, in 1960s and 1970s sociobiology, for instance, you see this happening over and over again, where the forms of social organization in social insects, in bees and in ants, for instance, are then used to make political comments on individualism and collectivism, for instance, in Cold War politics and Cold War. Particularly in Cold War, sort of like polemical writing during the Cold War. So there's this movement between biological terms, there's a linguistic movement in very much in sort of like categorical terms between biological thought and social thought, which in some ways has a kind of inevitability about it. And at this point is so deeply entrenched in forms of description in the biological sciences, particularly I think in the animal sciences, that it's very hard to see ways around it. And very little also, I mean, those sciences haven't gone through the kinds of self-destruction and partial reconstruction that the human sciences have gone through, in the sense of really this sort of like deep self-flagellation about our practices and ethics and what have you. To some extent they have. I mean, there's a whole field of bioethics, but it doesn't work at the level, it hasn't worked, so far as I'm aware anyway, at the level, at the sort of like meta level of thinking through, particularly thinking through the forms of description in science, in these sciences. So there's a whole set of there's a large domain that we can think about, and a long history that we can think about, of this sort of linguistic traffic and back and forth. So I suppose what I'm preoccupied, and that seems to come up in other people's talks as well, is the naturalization of this kind of language in common parlance, if you like. So that when we're using a term like invasion or alien, there's this constant slippage, and that we're not really sure if we're using this as a biological term, as a social term. It moves quite freely between them. And so I think one of the things that we might want to do in thinking through this is to try to specify a little more and draw attention to it and point to some of the consequences of using this kind of language. So.
I think I could agree with that framing, right, and that sort of critical move, in the sense of, right, looking at the discourse and its circulation politically. And at the same time, so when I co-taught a class with an urban ecologist here at the New School, and we had one session on invasive species, in which I presented the discourse argument about the way that native and invasive function, not just in politics, but even through conservation biology and other forms of science, and circulate, right? That there's sort of a circulatory work that discourse is doing. And he presented the argument from the side of conservation biology, which was to say that, okay, what if we change the labels on what we're doing? Let's not call them invasive species. Let's just call them something else, right? Harmful species. This is rhetoric, right? And yes, I agree with your critique, he said, but on the other hand, how do we move forward with the material study of invasive species in an ecological kind of setting? And so I came out of that class actually quite frustrated, and have been for years since, in that there are, sort of, this is Latour's, two houses mutually paralyzed, right? That the natural sciences and the social sciences, or sort of interpretive worlds, both connect and yet have a very deep disconnect at the very same time. And I think part of what I was interested in with all of your talks is to think, does a continuing focus on discourse, right, and the discourse of invasiveness actually hinder the possibility of those two kinds of knowledge meeting more fully in some way? And does that actually suggest that we, in some fashion, in social research, need to get to materialities or affect, or right? There are many different sorts of terms we could get to, but whether that would actually stop that kind of circulation over time, or at least help us understand it better. I wanted to also put a question to Alina a little bit, and maybe to others as well, that I was really interested to hear more about flyways and birds. I just wanted to relate a quick incident that happened on a recent research trip to the U.S.-Mexico border in Brownsville, Texas, as part of the Zim Institute here, with a number of people who are here. And we were down at the border wall at a site called Hidalgo Pump House, which is an old agricultural pumping station for water. It's also a major world birding center, right? So, which I didn't know and still know very little about. But people come from all over the world, all over the country, to watch the bird migrations here. And while we were there was just a very troubling incident that's really stuck with me and haunted me since then, which was that there were also, as we walked up to the border wall in this birding center, and there are people with binoculars everywhere looking for birds, there were also two individuals who were hiding in the grass who we spotted. And long story short, I guess, is that they had hopped the wall and they were trying to go north, and they were, I think, reported to the Border Patrol by a number of the birders who were there, right? And then very quickly, the Border Patrol apparatus sort of swoops down, and they're taken into a van and handcuffed and sent off. And it's just two very stark lines for me, in the sense that of trying to understand the relationship between invasiveness in human context and non-human context. That for many of the birders in this spot, there were two very distinct logics, right? Two very distinct ways of thinking about it, and the invasion of others from human context was very different from their sort of thrill at watching the flyways, right? Migratory birds from many different places, and the kind of hospitality, right, that they took on that. So I'm wondering, I guess my question in that long anecdote is really just, how do we think about, if that's the starkest version of a binary, in what ways do you think we might be able to use that proximity to sort of rethink invasiveness or invasion? Is there a way to, should we try to bring those more under a common umbrella, and is it sort of a way of trying to make people see the interconnections in their own logics? Are there actual practices of birding that can, the goat example actually, right, that can help us push forward beyond that?
I feel like Juanita should answer this question, but I think that's a really powerful story and example, and in a strange way, I mean, I think that because my research area is so different from the U.S.-Mexico border, there's no crossing, there's no human crossing, right? So those, I mean, there are, but not. Well, anyway, there are some. I should revise, but not through the DMZ. So I think that the kinds of, we could say like the intersection of paths doesn't really happen where I'm working, but at the same time, I think that I don't want to give the impression that, privileging one kind of movement over another is the way to go. I think that they have to be considered in the same frame as you're suggesting. I think that, but what we often see is precisely what you're describing, is a kind of, ecologists, whomever, who sort of, embrace the apolitics of what they do, or the non-political nature of what they do. And this, I see this all the time with the DMZ and inter-Korean politics. Are people saying, oh, we can use, the phrase is always the peaceful utilization of the DMZ, meaning because pure nature exists there, we can start using it as the premise for talking about human peace. But again, it presumes that the nature that exists there is kind of outside of politics, even though it's obviously at the center of it, right? So and this goes back to the language and metaphor thing, where, the naturalization logics that are invited especially when it comes to biodiversity, really encourage a kind of divestment of any kind of political narrative or real, questions about power and inequality. So that's a long-winded way of saying it doesn't quite relate to what I do. It definitely relates to what Juanita does, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on it. But I think that the encouragement to think about those things as being always in the same frame is really important.
I'll pitch a couple more questions, and then we can open it up to the audience, I guess. Just briefly for Fabio, I thought the encouragement to think about porosity as a way to avoid the binary of invasive and sort of self-contained body, I think is quite provocative, and to think also of that porosity at very sort of invisible levels almost. We don't see a lot of how porous we are, right? I wonder how well that scales up. But I think my question is that even if we acknowledge the porosity of the human body and perhaps of community, metaphorically speaking, I wonder to what extent that really solves or opens onto more hospitable or sort of cosmopolitan outcomes, as I think you sort of gestured to it. In that, I think porosity can work in a number of different positive and negative valences, and perhaps not different that way from more sovereign account of bodies or of communities. They still sort of have the question of what are the negative, if one is porous and made by many different sorts of things, some of those things may be more or less desirable, right?
Yes.
And the parasites have that, I'm sorry, I assume I'm loud enough to be heard. Mumbling.
I can hear
You can.
I can hear
So the parasites as having a negative, right? They can sort of have negative effects in ecological terms sometimes, right? Neutral ones or indeed positive ones, and I just wonder if those different valences change when we move from the sort of strict body to the porous body.
And I think what you were mentioning before, the necessity for the social sciences and discourse analysis to look at the natural sciences and biology, in the case of food, is front and center. Again, if you eat something that doesn't sit well with you, you can be sick or you can die. So there's always a risk there. It all becomes a matter of risk management, in a way. I didn't have time to go into it, but many of the SPS regulations of the WTO are built around the concept of risk and how, in fact, risk talks both to the biological sciences, but also to cultural and social context, because certain elements can be perceived as dangerous in a culture or another. So this porosity happens at all levels. I don't think that it gives us solutions, but it gives us way to think in a way that takes all these elements into consideration. And the fact that all it's mediated through the body, I think it's very important. here we're talking about embodied experiences. Before you mentioned affect, fears. In a way, our body, we don't want to get sick, right? So how do we construct this negotiation between the reality of the fear of dying and the reality that we're, always and already, as they say, porous and colonized and invaded? I don't think we can get out of that. I think that, in a way, defines us. And here there is another metaphor that has been proposed by my former political science professor in Italy, Roberto Esposito. He wrote a book called Communitas. What is that? Com munus. Munus, it's the gift, in a way, that you give for free and that you share. And so, in a way, it's at the core of commensality, which is also, sharing the table. Somehow we're consuming and eating together. And interestingly, he wrote Communitas, and then he wrote Immunitas, where he actually went into looking at how the same discourse becomes the basis for exclusion, for fear. But I like the idea of porosity precisely because it doesn't solve, but it puts us in front of a deep reality of who we are, and I think how, the world somehow works.
I think we'll open up for questions. How does this work? We have a microphone going around. Great. Yes.
Thank you all very much. I really have enjoyed this over the past 2 days. It's been excellent. And especially, Hugh, that article in Times, in fact, I've been thinking with for a very long time. And it's been something, whether you continue to like it or not.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. And this is kind of talking about naturalization of metaphor and the kind of feedback between the social, the political, and maybe the sciences language that we've been talking about. So I wrote this down just so we can be brief about it. But over the last 2 days, we've been considering the compelling idea that we need to rid ourselves of the notion that a people belong to a place, or conversely, that a place belongs to a people. To rid ourselves of the notion that that an idea belongs to a place, or that a stable or pure ecology is a fantasy. We're colonies. We're colonized by germs, and we could not, in fact, survive without microbial overlords, referring to gut flora and decision making. That's recent data. So, working here with invasion not merely as a metaphor for its transferable meaning for moving in. This line of thinking is, to some, a striking refiguration of a familiar logic. It sustains a logic of their dispossession of their land, their ideas or traditions, and in fact, their bodies. So one of the things, in fact, with your article, having talked to some of the people I work with about it, the kind of compelling and sense-making that I get from where I'm inspired by it, but the difficulty in having this conversation and as well with you, Fabio. So I guess maybe if you could just maybe respond to what I said.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. Well, and this also picks up on what Rafi was saying about this opposition between discourse and materiality. And I suppose one of the things we're talking about here really is the materiality of discourse and its concrete material, not just its concrete material effects, its actual material existence as well. But I think you're right that that this work on microbiomes has been, it's potentially a radical reconfiguration, not only of the way we think about bodies, but the way we think about relations with well, it can be a reconfiguration of the way that you think about a human body and the integrity of the body, and as you say, its porosity. I mean, that's an obvious place to go with it. Whether or not that's actually somewhere that it will lead in terms of a significant sort of a significant reconfiguration that way. It's hard to say, of course, because the sense of bodily integrity is so strong, despite all the ways in which it's undermined. But it also opens up the possibilities for thinking about, I guess, is thinking about the absence of purities, which is something I was thinking about here in important ways. So, yeah, I mean, this becomes a start. If this is where you were going, it becomes a recently new starting point to start having these kinds of conversations, which of course is very interesting. Especially, I think, when these things are grounded, they're actually grounded in science, and you can take a non-deconstructionist view of science and actually start to talk about science as a kind of as a set of facts and realities. It's a sort of very interesting way to work from, I think, partly just because the constant deconstruction and sort of discursive making of everything becomes sort of exhausting after a point, and it's kind of nice sometimes to have this point of a sort of solid point of working from, even if it's a rhetorical gesture, you know. So there's something about the way this stuff is circulated popularly and started to get some kind of grounding that I think is very interesting and potentially important. Now, you know, you could say that this is it's a moment, right? It's a moment of movement from one paradigm to another, and so at this point opens up a new set of possibilities. So in that sense, I don't know if I'm getting towards your comment, but in that way, I think, yeah, I would entirely agree with you. It's very interesting. So it's a movement away from where I was writing about 5 years ago, because that stuff wasn't in my mind at all. But it would contribute to the general direction of that argument. But again, I think I guess the only other thing I'd say is that I think it's partly a question of affinities. You know, presumably many of us here feel an affinity with that style of arguing and that style of thinking, and so would take this kind of science in that sort of direction, and would use it as that sort of opening. Now, how that works in terms of a form of argument for people who don't feel the appeal of that kind of reasoning and that form of logical and argumentative structure is really, really hard to say, I think. So in a way, partly I think what the issue is the forms of argument and the forms of I don't know what the term would be, like engagement or something, that might be possible in this moment. So you can see I'm sort of overwhelmed these days by, not so. In some ways, it's the issue to me isn't so much that these alternatives and opportunities exist. It's sort of like what happens with them and what you do with them. So in some ways, then, an appeal to the real of science is quite attractive, because that's a point of, it might be a point of commonality and agreement. Anyway, it's just some ideas.
Okay, this is on. So thank you all so much. It was really generative in thinking about stuff. So Rafi, when you were talking about going to the Hidalgo pump house, which I've been to lots of times, and what came to my mind was a song by a conjunto group where they sing about los birds pa'l south y nosotros pa'l norte, right? So the birds are going south and we're going north, coming from communities of migrant workers whose communities revolve around that circularity, which in many ways doesn't exist that much as it once did. And then I thought, well, conjunto comes from the mixture of German polka and indigenous drumming and Spanish guitars, right? So my question is whether or not we can look to communities of the South for alternative framings, because for many of these communities that have this circulatory migration in their sort of model way of being, right? What's the language? And not that it's some kind of pure language, right? But what are the ways of thinking, and how can we bring those into discourse to think about alternative ways of conceptualizing this kind of thing, right? That moves away from this idea of purity and invasion. It's one thing that working on the border that's really struck me is just the extent to which these national borders are just so meaningless, not, I mean, they're meaningful in the sense that they like stop people, but they're meaningless in the in an ideological sense. In that, I mean, of course we should go north. Like that's how it goes, right? That's how it is. And so I also was thinking about the fact that the folks that you saw hiding in the bushes probably like work in Brownsville or something, right? Like people, not Brownsville, but maybe in that case McAllen or something. Like people in that area cross all the time and they get caught all the time, but they keep crossing all the time because that's where their families live, that's where their girlfriend is, that's where the boyfriend, right? Okay, so my question is about communities of the South, but within that I was thinking about your comment, your framing of becoming goat. So if we think about communities of the South, can we think about non-humans, as you know, put into that category of the South, and also think about other ways of being, like being with beings as you were? Yeah, what are some of the concepts that can come with that sitting, or with that standing, or with that moving, right? That offer a different language. I don't know if that's a clear question.
Yeah, it was very clear to me because I've done. I mean, you know, thinking about. I mean, in a way, I guess I've been trying to think about how to write about these relations between the people I study and the non-human life that they study. And to get back to the question about bodies and affect, I mean, that was part of the point of the paper, is that, you know, it's like their relationship to these birds is of course mediated, but in this case, like entirely embodied as well. And so for me, it was like a sort of, it was almost like a ritual. Like I entered into this space and I came out transformed, you know. And I think that, you know, it's not to say that they in any way have some like real like sense of the bird's interiority, but you know that this is a kind of movement towards understanding at least these ecologies, and you know, trying to kind of incorporate the ways in which media, technology are just so impossibly intertwined with all of these ways of knowing. I don't remember your question right now, but that's kind of where, you know, how I'm approaching the ethnography and the knowledge production. And you know, I mean, and there's been so much written, you know, by anthropologists who study Amazonia and other indigenous groups in terms of very alternative ways of understanding, you know, the nature culture divide that, you know, still sort of orients most of our thinking. So you know, I've learned tons from that work. So.
Okay. I hope people can hear me. Thank you guys for your papers. They were really great, and I was hoping to maybe solicit some of your thoughts about invasiveness and temporality, because it seems like throughout the last 2 days, both time and space have come up in conversation. This is also prompted by the cartoon with like the genetically modified salmon, but also thinking in other contexts, including the Anthropocene and sort of counterterrorism and migration and things like that. But it seems like time has come up only kind of sporadically in these conversations, but it also seems to me that sort of invasiveness in an ecological register too, at least in terms of how it's talked about often in the US, like is very much a temporal construct as well. When you're thinking about harm, it's not so much the fact of a spatial breach in a moment, but it's rather this sort of the harm that is presumed to unfurl, you know, as ecologies become destabilized. So I was just wondering, you know, whether or not there's something also in the sort of anticipatory logics of that also underpin thinking about invasiveness that might be critically examined or denaturalized.
I don't know. Just the first reaction to your question is the idea of immunization, right? That works over time. So what if something that now is perceived as invasive over time becomes, in a way, part of who we are through a process of immunization, which is not immediately maybe refusal, but the ecosystem changes over time. But I think what's interesting in these issues when we project, the metaphors and the slippages onto politics, temporality is not the most important category. In the example I gave, about the couscous and the polenta, they didn't care about the reality of temporality. What was important was the urgency of feeling invaded by unknown people. And the desire that, the society doesn't get used to this. And we keep on feeling these people, these foods as external. So, temporality, it's very important when you go, from the politics to the biological. But at the same time, it's used in very creative way and brought back into the political to serve different goals and aims that maybe have nothing to do with the actual development of things as they happened. I don't know. This is just a gut reaction to your question.
Can I respond to that one? I guess one way to take that is to think about, the conceit of the Anthropocene is that we live in apocalyptic times, and that invasives are part of that. And they're often thought of in these. Talking about biological invasive species, they're often thought of in these apocalyptic terms. So there's, the standard examples of zebra mussels and kuzu and things like that. These highly destructive forms. So there is definitely a question about temporality, but it's this sense of this approaching disaster, and so that it's anticipatory in that sense, I think. And then the only response is some kind of remediation or hope or this kind of thing. And it's sort of ironic, and well, not ironic's not really the word, but there's a weird sort of disjuncture, because at the same time, the idea of the Anthropocene is that it's a geologic time period, and geologic time works on these massive, like superhuman scales. So there's a weird disjuncture. There's this weird disjuncture going on between the immediacy of disaster, if you like, and it's like rapid, uncontrollable approach, and the sense that these things have been unfolding, would sort of like naturally unfold on an entirely different time scale, that we're also participating in some way. So, so I think you're right to raise that question, and invasives are actually part of that narrative, if you like.
This sounds very simple, but I think we need to remember that there are limits to language, and I think it's the search for a kind of language to transgress this might actually hinder the creative process of finding possibilities. I just wanted to remind us of the limits of language. There's a... I'll get back to that. I've currently run out. But there's 3 little moments I wanted to bring up. Fabio, you mentioned something about the fear of food. I've been thinking about this fear and the fear of the other and fear. And I'm wondering if there's... if we can flip that to a kind of appreciation. I'm thinking about the way flu shots work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm no scientist here, but infecting the body with the flu to help to get rid of the flu, right? Or C. diff is a kind of condition of the intestinal tract or something. And I know that there are studies that are in Australia, I think it is, where they're actually using fecal implants to combat this. And here's this, fecal matter, and we think of it as this, maybe we even fear it, right? And this, some other disability theorist wrote a book called The Politics of Shit. Just on that note. And then also some strands of HIV, I believe, are being used to combat other strands of cancer. And, I don't know if there's a word for this kind of model, but for us to look at the value of this scary invasive other and utilize something there. I don't know if that could relate to your disciplines, or if we have a name for that kind of model.
I don't know about the name, but it's what I was mentioning before, this sort of ambivalence between neophilia and neophobia. We cannot get out of that. We are afraid, but at the same time, we need something different. It becomes desire, in a way. Desire and need at that point become sort of complicated. And, the first reaction where you pass from the neophobia to the neophilia, it's going through this phase of disgust, in a way, And the example of the microbiome is very interesting from that point of view. And it happens a lot with food. When there are new foods introduced to us, sometimes, we have this reaction of, no, this is not good for me. And then you taste it and you're like, okay, maybe I can add this to my, and so through this management and negotiation with disgust, you go from the fear to somehow the inclusion and even to the desire. I mean, recently I have been having exchanges with the Nordic Food Lab that works with Noma in Copenhagen. And I was there and they had me taste insects for the first time. That was an interesting experience for me. And I was not completely new to the idea. I grew up in a region of Italy where we have cheese with, tiny maggots, and it's part of the cheese, and it's delicious. But moving from that, which was sort of the habitual disgust in a way, to this new form, it took me, it took a little while. And I think, this metaphorically can be extended also to other aspects. I mean, the idea of deimmunization in a way is the same, the fear, the disgust, and then, you ask that for yourself when you go and get your shot. I don't know, maybe that's a way to think about it.
Yes, I have two questions, one for Hugh and one for Professor Kim. I really love the way all the panels have opened up the questions of mobility, migration, and sort of interspecies politics. But for Hugh, my question is around the moment where you said you were moved by the ceremony. After all, it's called a naturalization ceremony. I hadn't quite thought of that in relation to this conference. But I was not expecting you to say that you were moved. So I was wondering if you could just reflect on exactly sort of why that was the case and how that might link even just to the notion of the cemetery ceremony issue. But I think there's something going on in the affective piece there that I'd just like to see if you have any thoughts on. And then for Professor Kim, my question is, or the bit that I would have loved more, as soon as you had mentioned it, was the soundscape. So I have this deep longing now to have heard the soundtrack. And I think that's connected for me to Rafi's question about how to open up the kind of domains of sort of discursive communication. And I wonder if you could talk more about soundscapes and soundtracks, and if we could hear it at some point.
you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, you know, Vicky, that was it was surprising to me too. I went in, with the predictable cynicism to the whole thing, just like, really, really happy to get it over and done with. And, also I'd gone through this whole thing, like I'm sure many people do, of, do I want to do this or don't I want to do this? Oh, well, what the hell, I might as well do it anyway because I can keep my other passport, And, but it was it was a sort of humbling experience, actually, for me, partly because, yeah, partly because it was such a wide range of people in there, and people talked a little, so you got a sense of what people's why people were doing it, and there was a kind of, I know that I feel weird even saying this, but there was sort of a moment when there was this sort of shift to sincerity, I suppose. Like everybody had been, not everybody, but many people had been sort of like messing around or just like rolling their eyes at all the stuff for quite a while during the process. Because, to get there, and I mean, it's a lot easier for me than for many people, but to actually get to that point, the crap that you have to go through, I mean, I don't know if other people, I'm sure plenty of other people here have been in this situation, but, just going down to Federal Plaza over and over and over again. I mean, it took me like, I don't know, like 11 years, I think, because it got caught up in 9/11 in the middle of it, so my whole file just sort of disappeared for about 3 years, whilst they turned their attention to other things. So there was this, so I'd gone through this whole thing of going down there and just watching. It didn't particularly happen to me. I mean, I had a lot of inconvenience. Like, you'd get to, do people really want to hear this? I mean, it doesn't seem like, I guess we have time, right? But, of getting down there and standing in line for getting down at like 7 o'clock in the morning downtown and standing in line, finally getting to the window, and as you get to the window, they put up a sign saying closed for the day, even though it's only like 9:15 or something, like we've reached our quota for the day. This kind of thing, like over and over again, seeing people whose first language wasn't English, just getting shouted at because, when they were talked louder to, then they'd have more chance of understanding, this kind of thing. I mean, just abusive. And actually under Obama, things have got better because there was this whole thing of sort of like civilizing the process to some extent, but I've actually, because I've passed that stage now, I have no idea what it's actually like. But it was a really abusive, difficult thing that at each point, people, because, you'd then have to leave the buildings and you'd be in the elevator and everybody would just be like venting about what they'd just gone through. And, so everybody's caught in this position of just not wanting to participate in this thing any longer, but sort of having to, because you're committed to this past, because, for whatever personal reasons, you're committed to trying to get some sort of like regularization of your status in this country. So you have no option, and of course the people on the other side of it know you have no option, so they're, just taking full advantage of that, because it's that kind of abusive structure that you're caught up in. Sorry, I can whine about this for a very long time, sorry. But so the ceremony was sort of the culmination of that, but it was also this point where sort of a kind of relief, I suppose, but also there was this recognition on the other side, on the side of the people who were, supervising the ceremony, that moment was past. It was like you'd sort of gone through that, and you are now sort of being accepted into this community, which is a very weird, ambivalent thing, given what, apart from anything, given your ambivalence about that community anyway, but also what you've been through to get there. So it was a very surprising thing. I think my reaction was a sort of, I thought it would actually be a temporary one as well. And I was sort of like embarrassed at feeling this sort of like wave of sincerity, because we're all taught to be so, like cynical about all this. And I've learned to sort of like inhabit that, this persona of cynicism, I suppose, around these kinds of questions. But then writing this piece actually made me revisit that and think that what sounded like platitudes at the time, or what sort of quite quickly afterwards started to feel like platitudes, actually at some level were very meaningful, because it's a very powerful strain of American thought that actually, having grown up in Britain and always felt at some level you didn't belong, because you'd always be reminded that you didn't belong. but then coming to New York and feeling actually very, very differently about it. And I appreciate all the reasons why I'm able to feel like that and other people aren't. But I feel like it's a very strong, important tradition in American political life that actually should be protected despite its limitations and all its problems. Just, I guess, effective in ways that I hadn't really thought about before. So I think that was a very, very long answer to the question, but anyway, that's more or less it, yeah.
So I'll be very quick. As far as soundscapes, yes, it was, I'm sorry I didn't have the clip to share with you all. You may have not liked me so much after you had heard it. It was very deafening. But just in terms of, you know, how I think about it, I mean, it was really kind of like reaching the sensory limits of one's body. And the ornithologist who I traveled with, he had once spent the night on that island, and he said they never stop. So it's just, you know, you feel completely as if you're inside this, you know, this really inhospitable place for you know, for non-avians. And for some of the birds as well, pretty inhospitable. But I was also interested in how, you know, for the, you know, and some of you may be familiar with efforts on the part of the International Crane Foundation to save endangered cranes in the U.S., where they put on like crane outfits and, you know, act as the sort of parents in loco parentis for baby cranes. And they've just decided to discontinue that project because the cranes who've been raised by the humans in crane clothing aren't able to raise their own chicks. They end up dying because they actually weren't parented. So anyway, this is not to sort of return to some pure notion of nature, but just I think it's interesting to think about sort of biosemiotics and how different kinds of communication are sort of invented by the people who are studying, in this case, birds. So, you know, taking on the goat's clothing was one sort of biosemiotic example, and I think, you know, and one that didn't happen was there were no bird calls. They weren't trying to use, you know, vocalizations to reach out to the birds. And the last thing I'll say is the DMZ research that I've done, in fact, is marked by a lot of silence. And so most people who go there will just remark upon how different it is from an urban soundscape, and that becomes part of the sort of another layer of naturalizing that environment as being, you know, much more exotic and foreign for visitors. So.
I think we'll take one round of questions, and if there are any, and you can respond to whichever you like, and we can end.
This is a more general question, so it can go also to other participants or speakers. Yesterday I was thinking about this term entanglement, and we are so interconnected, and yet I was somehow, you know, not feeling the connection because we are talking about the invasive other, sorry. Have you heard the previous? Okay. We're talking about the invasive other, but we are not talking so much about the defensive self. Like, there is so much defensiveness and, you know, the constant feeling under threat and perpetually not trusting that, and I think maybe David brought this up in his presentation. So I refuse to feel pessimistic about this apocalyptic, you know, world. I would like some hope about how we can collectively survive, even including the non-humans. So I wanted just to ask about some thoughts on the...
You don't have to worry about non-humans.
No, I mean how the humans collaboratively can survive, not...
Yeah.
All right?
Okay, glasses.
I don't know. I think I sort of expressed my point of view in the previous answer. It is the way we are, and you know, we eat together. In a way, we are what we eat with. For me, that's a little bit the answer to that very, very quickly.
can say it. Maybe they have concluded.
Do you have concluding remarks?
You know, I kind of want to respond to you, which is that, I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, there's always hope and possibility, and you can find it. It partly depends on how you look at things, right? You can find these things anywhere. I mean, perhaps there isn't anywhere the hope for, you know, large-scale utopian projects anymore, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think. But you can always read possibility out of a political situation. I mean, personally, I think the whole notion of the Anthropocene is baloney. But, you know, so I think it would be very helpful to set that aside, because it is an overwhelmingly apocalyptic vision. I don't think it's helpful conceptually or in any way at all. And it also, well, anyway, we don't have to do that. But you know, I don't worry about there not being hope in that sense, and don't worry about there not being non-humans. Non-humans in the broad sense are going to outlive humans without any difficulty at all. If you want to think about individual species, maybe it's another question. But there's certainly you don't have to be pessimistic necessarily, because being pessimistic isn't actually going to help you resolve anything anyway.
Any final thoughts? I think we'll stop there. Thank you all to the panelists and for the audience. Thank you.
Just to remind folks that the keynote is at 6 p.m., so you got about half an hour or so back here. Thank you very much.
It's really hard. And there's no, it's like it's really hard to talk about. Yeah, well, exactly. So let me just go say goodbye to Shah.
Yeah, exactly. They could have been like a double panel. Yeah.
Just general ideas.
So the review is going to be interesting. Having everything together. Yeah. Okay.
What about you? I wasn't even thinking about this. You brought it up.
Oh, I see. Oh.
Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah. It was really so stark.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But it was really makes a lot of sense. And how it relates to food.
Yeah.
And how it relates to
I already used his work in, my research on food. Strangely enough, I think he would be horrified, but.
No, I think you do wonderful. Your book sounds absolutely fantastic.
Oh,
I
can't
wait to read the book. I was just saying that we were all part of the fly. Well, no, but because we're not so fond of burgers because of that.
Put you on the spot.
I was like, there are no humans.
But you're in that zone. It's hard to get out, I guess.
What was that?
Now that you're looking at birds and
Yes,
non-human life, then
yes,
I think that's hard.
Exactly.
Stupid
No.
question.
Really important questions, actually, because it's
I mean, I'd known about the DMZ as this sort of, like you're saying, this sort of famous conservation hotspot. I bring it up all the time in classes, sort of thinking about military security and ecology.
Yeah.
Guantanamo, there are all these places around the world that have that site. And
Yeah.
I think it's really
No, I think I've had it in here from yesterday.
A lot of the work on conservation features tend to be, at least when they work with us, there'll be like a little survey of all the different sites, and I think they tend to be just like too.
Oh, I know he did the hard work.
Yeah, all the ironic stuff, and so I in my fantasy life would like have an edited volume, but I just don't know but I've become really fascinated with the wildlife conservation sites in the U.S. And also, I don't know if you know about this, but there are all these buffer zones around military training grounds and bases in the U.S. that are becoming de facto havens. Yeah, so suddenly the Department of Defense has to hire ecologists to monitor and manage these species, and then it just turns into a whole. Yeah, I mean it's like Vieques, but here.
I've been looking at this Guantanamo case more. There's a species there that the Hutia road beaver. It's endangered everywhere in the Caribbean except on the base. And there's a pest, and it's eating through like all the cables and the cars, and it's this really, it's called banana rat, is the other term for it, right? And there's this really horrible incident where they're taking detainees out, and they go show them these Hutia to tell them that they're below even the Hutia, this like animal that's shot on sight on the base.
Oh my God.
Right? And it's I would like to go sometime, but I can't imagine doing field work. I don't even do real field work. I'm just a political scientist hack, but I would love to be able to just understand, go and see what it's about.
Wow.
That's what I've been reading in relation to that. So
I wonder if they had to hire. I mean, it's not on U.S. soil, so maybe not. Whether they had to hire an ecologist because of the species there.
There's Toledo Zoo.
Oh, really?
Actually, there's been science there I didn't even know, for a century. Like, from the time the U.S. took over, they had natural scientists, botanists. Like, it's been from the get-go.
Right.
This parallel history. And that's where this idea of the exceptional quality of space actually didn't work.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm on about.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm really glad to have known about your show. I didn't even know.
Yeah, I mean.
You were just before you came, so I'm
Yeah,
going to go read more
wouldn't
now.
have,
Now that I know. I wouldn't know. That's an amazing project.
Yeah, no, I need to finish this book. That's the main thing.
Have you been at it for?
Yeah, I guess I mean I've been writing since 2013, I guess. So it's just slow going. But yeah, I'm eager to kind of wrap it up and get out there. But again, like I need to read your book, obviously. But your writing has been great. I mean, of course, I appreciate that you cite a lot of anthropologists.
Yeah, I hope. Try not to steal.
No. Yeah, because I read was it an Oxford? Interspecies.
Yeah, the environmental political theory.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, I wonder what political scientists are talking about. And then I was like, oh, it's mostly.
Wait, you're talking about.
But I was like, that's great, so.
Yeah. Outlier, that one. It's a more interesting water to swim. If I had to do it all over again.
Oh, really? Yeah, I was wondering about that, like how in your field, if you are, if you have other folks that
they're few. They're coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're behind. Political science is slow in if you're a discipline. So, I'm from IR land originally. Actually, there are very few people there.
Yeah.
There's a growing group that kind of reads in post-human-ish waters and then does work around, especially around security, because they're preoccupied with that. So I'm trying to rally it up.
Yeah. Do you know Ursula? I mean, she's not in political science, but in English. Ursula Heises.
I know her name.
Yeah. I know her book. She has a book on biodiversity coming out later this year.
Okay.
But
What's the last name again?
Heise? Stuff. I mean, she's coming from a lit background. She's kind of unpacking certain narratives. I mean, it would have resonated a lot with what we were talking about in terms of metaphors and narratives that naturalize certain ideas. But yeah, so she has a whole thing on biodiversity that I found really cool.
All right, I'll let you.
Okay.
Let's go. It was nice to meet you.
Test 1, 2, 3, 4. Test 1, 2.
Right.
You asked me to do this. So
No, you have this.
I'm honored to do it.
At the time, but still.
Hi, Miriam. So let's get started. I'm Will Milberg, the Dean of the New School for Social Research, and it's just a great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker to conclude the conference. This has been just a terrific series of sessions, a lot of great energy, a lot of new ideas. I really just want to start by thanking my colleagues for incredibly hard work in organizing this event. Arian Mack, the director of the Center for Public Scholarship, and Miriam Tickton, the co-director of the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility. Just a very creative program. I know how much hard work went into this. The scope of the panels really speaks very well of the current and I hope the future state of the study of migration and mobility issues at the New School. And we, of course, continue to honor with our Zolberg Institute the legacy of Ari Zolberg, and I'm pleased to see Vera here. But as this conference reveals immediately, we will also be committed to bringing new theoretical insights, even new methods to thinking about our highly mobile world. I don't know if you've done it already, but could we give a round of applause for Arian and Miriam? Really a terrific job and program. Michael Ignatieff is the Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice of the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He previously was the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard. From 2006 to 2011, he served as a member of the Canadian Parliament, as the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. So in this, as in other endeavors, he was ahead of his time. He is the author of 18 books on topics ranging from Canadian politics, American exceptionalism, ethics, terrorism, human rights, liberal political theory. In this conference, you have explored the invasive other, human, animal, biological, other forms of invasive others. You've explored it historically, culturally, economically, politically. There are a lot of dots to connect across the panels. And in this respect, I think we're in for a great treat with our keynote speaker, who's someone who connects dots very elegantly and very passionately. He has long understood the implications of invasions. I'm thinking of Iraq, Syria, and he has understood the emergence of a huge new class of others in the world today, of course, with the tide of refugees to Europe from Africa and the Middle East. While the others studied here are of course, very interestingly viewed as invasive, Of course, the non-others, the not others, have done their share of invasiveness also. And it's really the ethics of this connection that has been the focus of Michael Ignatieff's writing in the past few years, where he's done a critical analysis both of ISIS and of the United States, and both from a human rights perspective. And just 2 recent essays of his titles to give you a sense: Enough is Enough, U.S. Abdication on Syria Must Come to an End. America as Bystander to the Refugee Crisis. Professor Ignatieff is a great friend of and defender of the New School. He's a public intellectual in our greatest tradition. We began with the outspoken founders of the New School in 1919, Dewey, Beard, Veblen, through the period of our German Jewish refugee scholars, beginning in the 1930s, with people who were run out of Germany not just for being Jewish, but also for being outspoken public intellectuals on politics and economics, through, of course, Hannah Arendt, and then even today with our presence in the New York Times, Simon Critchley's philosophy column, The Stone, Federico Finkelstein's essays in the Latin American press, our growing web presence on Public Seminar that has really catapulted a lot of even our younger faculty into this public intellectual role. Professor Ignatieff is a steady contributor to some of the most important publications of our time: Financial Times, New York Times, you name it, Ethics and International Affairs, The Guardian, the Toronto Star, and of course, the Ottawa Citizen. Ignatieff is most of all in the Hannah Arendt tradition of philosophical sophistication, unwillingness to accept easy politically correct answers, and most importantly, an insistence on facing the ethical difficulties of any given historical moment. So enough of my meta-commentary. Please join me in welcoming Michael Ignatieff.
Great pleasure to be back at the New School. Great pleasure, although not unmixed, to be under the watchful eye of Arian Mack. All of us have been under the watchful eye of Arian Mack, and we've learned and become better human beings as a result. No one embodies the best traditions of this school better than this wonderful woman, and just want to congratulate her. I want to talk about the invasive other, and much of my remarks will focus, as you will expect, on migrants and refugees. But I did want to say before I go on 2 things. First of all, I was here for today, and many of the contributors, panelists, are here, and I just wanted to thank them for everything that I learned. I learned so much that I've had to rewrite my talk, which is my way of saying you said it better than me, so I would rather not say it again in your company. It's a way of registering what I learned from you, and I thank you very much. The second thing I wanted to say is many of you had wonderful slides. I have the most boring slides you're about to see, but they're there for a heuristic purpose, which is just to give you some chapter headings for what I want to say. Through most of the day, we talked about the use and abuse of science as metaphor. Science is science and metaphor is metaphor, and when the 2 get mixed up, particularly when we use metaphors derived from non-human species and apply them to human species, look out, trouble starts. I mean, this is very casual, but I pick up my New York Times this morning before I came here to this conference, and what am I looking at? I'm looking at a report from Burundi. Many of you know how tragic and difficult life in Burundi is, and that for 60 years it has been a place of recurrent interethnic killing. Well, folks, they're calling Tutsis cockroaches in Burundi. So you know what that means. We've been here before. The application of these metaphorical structures to human populations is almost always a prelude to something terrible, and we've known about that. And so I will not say much more about the abuse of metaphors derived from non-human populations or human populations. I just think everybody ought to be very careful when they hear that kind of language used. Let me get to the core of my topic, really, which is the refugee as invasive other, and give you a flavor of what is being said about refugees in some quarters in Europe at the moment. Czech and Slovak politicians and members of the Czech and Slovak medical profession have supported immigration restrictions or the closure of the Czech and Slovak borders on the grounds that refugees will bring in disease. So there's a very not so subtle elision between a human population reconstrued as a disease. That use of metaphor is a sure sign of trouble. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has justified the effective closing of the Hungarian border on the grounds that the refugees are a threat to quote-unquote Christian civilization, not just in Hungary, but in Europe. And that's a move where you see immediately what's going on. What is happening is that Islam, a great faith which has been in Europe for millennia, is being recategorized as the invasive other. Islam is being categorized as the invasive other, but history is being reconfigured as biology, and religion is being re-envisaged as disease. And that seems to me a metaphorical terrain that is always perilous to fragile human beings. Because when a victim is reconfigured as a threat, duties can be reinvented as burdens. We're in the extraordinary situation that people who are fleeing, their flight is being described as an invasion. People who are victims of civil war, climate change, various forms of catastrophes are properly most seen as victims, although they remain agents. But when they're called the invasive other, when they're othered in this way, a victim is redescribed as a threat. And the key move here is that the duties that we thought we had towards victims are then reinvented as burdens when you do that. And legal obligations are then regarded as a kind of unpleasant kind of moral blackmail. And the political consequences are very direct. When you metaphorically understand refugees and migrants in this way, you get, pretty quickly, you get the encampment, forced detention of refugees on islands in the Mediterranean. You get their forced repatriation, and you get walls. And you get the rhetoric of walls right across the political spectrum of liberal democracies, including in this country. You also get policy consequences very directly. I mean, this is a fact you all know, but the United States has taken less than 3,000 refugees in the entire period of the Syrian civil war. 3,000 is about what Germany was taking every day through 2015. So the political space for America to remain true to its historically generous reaction and treatment of refugees has collapsed. Refugees recategorized as threat close the political space in which someone like the president, who I think wants to take refugees, sees no political space to move to take refugees. When refugees are seen as the invasive threat, it's all the easier to conflate a terrorist and a refugee. And that conflation has been heightened, needless to say, by San Bernardino, by Brussels, and by Paris, even though the analytical and factual line between the two categories is very clear to anybody who looks at it. Paris and Brussels were not attacked by refugees. They were attacked, shock, horror, by citizens, by people born in Belgium and born in France. And that's a completely different problem than the refugee issue. All of this you know, and that's not really very interesting to tell you what you already know. What I want to do is do something slightly different, which is to look at the progressive response to this discourse of the refugee as invasive other, and be critical about this discourse. Give this discourse of universalism, cosmopolitanism, and hospitality, knock it around, and knock it around with you, so we see whether a progressive response to this crisis is still standing after we're done. The thing that is common to cosmopolitanism, moral universalism, by moral universalism I simply mean human rights universalism, and I'll get to this, Kantian hospitality. What's common to all these three is simply to say, and I know I'm simplifying, and I know this is an academic audience, but let me simplify just for fun, okay? In these three languages, there is no other. There's only us. The moral force of these three discourses is to empty the category of the other utterly. Because according, for example, to human rights universalism, which I teach, the otherness of strangers, the fact that they are of different races, classes, religions, or national origins, is morally irrelevant. It's morally irrelevant as any kind of justification for exclusion, because according to doctrines of cosmopolitanism and universalism, we're all tied together by a primal human bond. And when we accord rights to refugees, we are recognizing our common humanity. So there is no other in this discourse. That's what I mean by saying that otherness is morally irrelevant in universalist discourse. So what is morally significant is shared human identity and the reciprocal duties of asylum and protection that are due to every human being, to all of us. Not just to them, but to us, because them is us in this kind of discourse. And I think we have a profound moral attachment to these ideas. I certainly do. I'm just saying there's some problems with them, and we need to look at this honestly and talk about it. In the hospitality ethic that you see in Kant, and the philosophers I'm now sending up a government health warning. I'm no philosopher, so I may be getting Kant wrong, but my sense of the hospitality ideas in Kant is Kant does accept a distinction between a citizen and a stranger, but construes the obligations to the stranger as definitive of the moral identity of a citizen. So, and that sense of deep human commonality is one of the things about Kant that moves us after 200 years. Now, I want to contrast this with something that I would call the ordinary virtues perspective. I'm calling it that because I happen to be writing a book called The Ordinary Virtues, so you'll forgive me if I do a little of my own speak at this point. But the ordinary virtues are simply the ordinary virtues of ordinary life and ordinary people. What do I mean? I mean the ordinary virtues of pity and compassion and tolerance and friendliness and welcome. The ordinary virtues of us. I don't mean there's some ordinary people out there and we're special here. I mean us. The ordinary virtues of ordinary people. And I want to contrast the ways in which in ordinary virtue language we construe the obligations that come to us from the discourse of moral universalism. What I want to suggest is that universalism and cosmopolitanism are actually elite discourses, sociologically speaking. We've got some empirical evidence to confirm this. This is the language of international law. This is the language of states. This is the language of NGOs. This is the language of professors. This is the language of professionals. And there's a sociological distance between that language of ethical universalism and the language of ordinary virtue. But it's not the sociological distinction between ordinary virtue and universalist cosmopolitanism I want to focus on. It's how these two these two moral communities see the refugee. And I'm calling it an ordinary virtue perspective because what I'm trying to get at is that the universalists among us look at the resistance to refugees as basically kind of racism. I mean, these folks just don't get it. They don't understand that them is us, and we're all in the same boat, and these obligations flow from our common humanity. And there's something wrong with people who don't accept these universalist obligations. And I actually see something slightly different in the politics of the refugee crisis. I see thousands and thousands of Europeans, ordinary Europeans, who handed out water, who brought blankets to the stations in Munich and Hungary, Budapest, who housed strangers, who every time the police would put out a text message would respond with, more aid and more assistance during that crucial period of crisis in the Munich station and the Budapest station. That generosity was a significant social fact. And then you ask yourself, why did those people do that? What led them to these acts of generosity and compassion and care? And one thing you could conclude is that they did so because they accept a series of universalist premises, that this is universalism in action. And what I want to suggest to you is that that's not right. That ordinary virtues are not the domestication of universal values. They're actually at odds with moral universalism. And I don't think we've faced the political implications of that sufficiently. Because from an ordinary virtue perspective, the stranger is other. The difference between us and them is primary. Difference is primary. Commonality is not assumed. Commonality is negotiated encounter by encounter. There's no generalization that goes on. There's only this refugee here at this station in this desperate situation. And there's no assumption of a generalized and universal obligation here at all. This is pity and compassion at work, individual to individual. And that's different, fundamentally different from a moral universalist perspective. And so tolerance, another of the ordinary virtues, is essentially transactional. It's recognized and extended if the transaction with difference is successful. And tolerance always congratulates itself on overcoming the barrier of difference, but not erasing the barrier of difference. And tolerance from the ordinary virtue perspective ceases to be real if it's generalized to the whole human race. The tolerance you extend is to her, to him, not to the whole human race. That's the ordinary virtue perspective. And the other thing is that tolerance is conditional. It's conditional on mutual recognition. I say yes to you on condition you say yes to me. And if a stranger no longer plays by the rules, if a stranger abuses your compassion and hospitality, if the stranger denies recognition to who you are, the tolerance can vanish. And this is not an attempt to describe a racist. This is an attempt to describe someone who's actually a compassionate and generous person. But they don't work the world, they don't see the world in terms of universals. They don't, because the universals are meaningless to them. They may be meaningless to us, is what I'm suggesting. And where this goes has a political consequence we need to face, which is, from the ordinary virtue perspective, there is no assumption that asylum and international refugee protection is a right. It's actually a gift. And I want to make the contrast between a right and a gift here. Ordinary virtue assumes asylum is a gift of a scarce good, which is access to the rights and privileges and income of the host society. The host-guest distinction is primary in ordinary virtue, and it's irrelevant in the international and universalized perspective. The citizen-stranger distinction is primary to ordinary virtue and morally irrelevant in the universalized perspective. And so if ordinary virtue assumes that asylum is a gift of a scarce good, there's a limit to hospitality. If it's a gift, it runs out. There's only so much of it. And so ordinary virtue supposes the proposition that hospitality is limited. And there is such a thing as the house being full. Whereas under international law, under the International Refugee Convention, there is no ceiling. The obligation is potentially infinite. That's why it's universal. That's what we like about it. But that is not how ordinary, compassionate, generous citizens see the business of what do I do about that stranger at my door? And that's what I'm trying to get us to focus upon. So once those folks are taken in, ordinary virtue supports the proposition that continued hospitality is conditional on integration, on their acceptance of our values. We say yes to them on condition that they say yes to us. And from this ordinary virtue perspective, a government should be compassionate and generous. To repeat, this is not the rhetoric of racists. Countries should be generous. Germany should be generous. Britain should be generous. The United States should be generous. But it's not in fulfillment of a universal obligation. It's the hospitality that a host shows to a guest, and it's conditional on the guest respecting the rules of the host, and it's a finite good. There are only so many rooms in our house, not an infinite number of rooms. And what this gets to is another problem, which is that in a democracy, a government's asylum obligations, ratified in international law, are universal. But their execution, their operation, and respect for them is conditional on citizens' consent. And there is, in my view, a quite substantial and undiscussed conflict between universal obligation and democratic consent. And the assumption that in ordinary virtue people make is that citizens come first and strangers come second. And that's the condition on which citizens' consent for asylum and refugee assistance can be granted. And when citizens' consent fractures under the pressure of numbers, governments are entitled to abridge their asylum obligations. Now, I don't want to go by another thing that we need to think about, which is that governments are then shameless about exploiting the language of ordinary virtue. One of the things, my wife happens to be Hungarian, and she's here, by the way, so she's quality control. You'll be relieved to know she watches me like a hawk. But one of the things you see in Hungary is that governments exploit and manipulate this ordinary virtue consciousness. Viktor Orban actually, when pressed about why he's shutting the door, and doesn't this prove that your country is racist and reactionary and against the European trends, Orban, with what can only be described as consummate chutzpah, says, wait a minute, no, that's not true. Look at how generous our people are. Look at how many bottles of water Hungarian citizens have handed out. We're not racist. He exploits the generosity of his fellow citizens to shut the door on refugees, right? So this is a complicated game that we need to. And citizens in turn, and this is where it becomes complicated, citizens who are generous and compassionate towards strangers collude with governments in construing the asylum obligation as a discretionary gift. And so this is how we begin to get doors shutting around Europe. And there is a conflict, as I'm trying to say, between obligation and consent, which most international human rights teachers, and I'm one of them, haven't really faced up to. Universalists and cosmopolitans, and I count myself as one, should defend asylum as a right, but we need to engage with the competing idea of asylum as a gift. And this can't simply be dismissed as a conceptual error. There is a conflict between democratic consent and universal obligation, and it becomes obvious in Germany. That's what Angela Merkel's problem is in a nutshell. She's got a Grundgesetz, a fundamental law, which says that refugee obligation is a universally compulsory international obligation. It's not discretionary. And she signed onto it for the reasons we don't need to rehearse. Germany's horrible history. And then it looks just fine as long as you've got one refugee, then another, then another, then another. But when you have 1.5 million, the question of whether you can continue to comply with a universal obligation that has no cap and maintain democratic consent for taking anybody in becomes your political problem. And it's a real political problem. And she, as you know, is massaging this and managing this with a very, very morally problematic and politically problematic deal with Germany to throttle down refugee flows. And it does involve encampment of refugees in Turkey, in Greece, shipping them back to Turkey, and then taking one Syrian into Germany for every Syrian sent back from Greece. This is essentially a rationing system. It's walking away from universal obligation to ration a generosity, and she has majority German support. Human rights defenders, from the UNHCR to Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, all of them are outraged by what I'm saying. Because they think, and it's the role morality of human rights defenders, to defend universal obligation come what way. And I'm saying, fine, but I've been in politics, and if you want to maintain political consent, you simply have to ration universal obligations when you're talking about 1.5 million people, right? So there's a flagrant conflict between deontological moral principle as expressed by those universal refugee convention obligations and the political problem maintaining consent. And the real problem with consent is not just the numbers, I'm trying to suggest something else more interesting, which is that ordinary citizens do not understand universal obligation itself. They reject it. They believe that asylum is a gift, not a right. And that's the fundamental problem that Mrs. Merkel has to deal with, and every country has to deal with in dealing with these issues of sustaining consent and acceptance for generous refugee policy. The second related difficulty is, as I said, for an ordinary citizen, acceptance of strangers is contingent on a process of mutual recognition. We need to think of integration of immigrants and integration of migrants and integration of refugees as a process of mutual recognition, because that's how ordinary citizens see it. I say yes to you on condition that you say yes to me. And when it appears, as it's appeared in Cologne railway station, that some foreigners were not saying yes, the deal is off very quickly. And so this is the kind of problem we need to think about. The yes is hard to define. And let's also be clear, I am a paid-up liberal. I understand I'm living in a pluralist society. Part of what makes this complicated is if you ask the question, what is the yes that we're demanding of strangers? The prior question that we all need to ask as citizens is, what is the yes that is asked of us? Because it would surely be incoherent to ask of strangers a yes that we do not give to our own societies. None of us in this room say yes to the entirety of the United States. Most of us spend half of our time complaining about some aspect of American society, and quite properly too. We do not demand yes, a universal yes, as a condition of citizenship, nor should we. It would be destructive of our liberty. But citizens nevertheless feel there is a yes we want to demand of a stranger. And those of us who've been through citizenship ceremonies in this country know what it is. You swear the oath. The judge gives you a little ceremony. And what you're essentially saying yes to is the Constitution of the United States and the rule of law. Minimalist. Beyond that, you can argue, you can push and shove, you can do what you want, but we have not defined, and Germany is struggling to define, what that yes means. The minimum core has to be the constitutional rule of law, and beyond that, we don't know what else we want to demand. I would demand the minimum, just so it's clear, but we are asking them, in effect, to surrender some degree of their otherness. That's what the bottom line is. And then the question is, what is that otherness? So I want to conclude, because I see I've run a little longer than I thought. I've said that. I forgot my chapter headings. There you go. There you go. There you go. You're having a reprise of my talk, because I got carried away here. I want to maintain consent. Let's be clear. I'm trying to deal with the politics of this instead of brushing by it. And that's, whoops. So there we are. Let me talk very briefly about maintaining consent for asylum. I'm essentially saying that if you teach human rights and you defend human rights, as I have done, you're aware in the climate of our times that we are in a crisis of moral universals. Human rights is under attack as never before. I was associated with responsibility to protect and other doctrines that sought to constrain sovereignty in the modern world. The rollback now, the reassertion of sovereignty is very strong. As the barbed wire is rolled up around European states, you can feel the moral universals under pressure of national interest and national sovereignty pretty well everywhere. The United States tradition of acceptance of refugees is being slowly throttled or strangled by this moral climate, and it should concern all of us. But the crisis of moral universals, when you talk to human rights advocates and defenders, is construed to be a crisis of enforcement and compliance. That is, the crisis is, why can't we get states to enforce and comply with international law? That's what the crisis of universal is all about. I'm actually saying it goes deeper than that. It's a crisis of popular consent in democracies itself, under the impact of terrorism, under the pressure of migratory flows. The very consent necessary to sustain state compliance and state enforcement is under attack. And so we need to think seriously and take seriously, if we're Democrats, the potential conflict between democratic consent and universal values, and be honest about that, and then engage our citizens honestly in this discussion, instead of dismissing them all as, low-browed, knuckle-dragging racists. But actually say there is a problem of maintaining democratic consent. So how do we maintain consent as a practical political matter? Consent means migration regimes that combine fairness with control. It means we need to have safe third country designations. We need to say, yes, Turkey's not perfect, but it's a safe third country. What I just said is heresy in the human rights community, but where else do you propose to put the refugees if they can't get into Europe? I mean, I don't like Turkey much more than you do, but show me another solution. That's why you designate Turkey as a safe third country. We need, in addition, to maintain and defend individualized determination processes for refugees and survival migrants, and I'll talk a little bit about survival migrants. The other thing that is a huge pressure, and those of you who read the New York Times will know this, there is a new category besides refugees of survival migrants. That is people fleeing climate change, fleeing civil war, fleeing state breakdown. New York Times columnist was in a small village in Senegal. You may have read that wonderful column. Desertification, climate change is simply destroying rural agriculture in West Africa. And what happens? They all end up on the Libyan littoral trying to get to Italy. This is our future, folks. Millions and millions and millions of people on the move. And on the southern frontier of the United States, enormous and recurring migratory pressures from Salvador, Guatemala, and other Latin American countries. We need to preserve individual determination of their refugee claims, but we need to begin to move towards international agreements on survival migration streams so we can begin to respond to these pressures. Because the other thing, finally, that the economists are saying, and this helps us to understand migration, is understood economically, the single most important thing that any family in the world can do in Africa, in Asia, and in poor countries to improve their life situation and their lifetime earning power is to migrate. Let's understand these folks as rational actors. It is the single most useful thing that they can do, and the remittance streams that they send back to their host countries is the single most important development income stream going into these countries, right? So this is our world. This is the 21st century. And we've tacitly allowed ever stricter border control as our response to these migration pressures. And I think we need to have regularized, decent, internationally mandated migration streams. And we need to be inventive in ways that we haven't been before. I am the son of refugees. My name is Ignatieff, Russian. And one of the documents that I treasure from my personal past are the Nansen passports of my grandparents. I don't know, I see some heads nodding in recognition of what a Nansen passport is. Fridtjof Nansen, the great Norwegian explorer, became the first international leader of the forerunner of the UNHCR, became in the 1920s. There were 2 million plus Russian refugees streaming into Europe after the Russian Revolution. And Fridtjof Nansen understood immediately what they needed. They needed papers. They needed a document that will allow them to travel. Why is it that we are incapable of providing a biometric migration card identifier for survival migrants and regular economic migrants? To give them papers so they don't have to go underground, so we can create migration regimes that have an entry date and an exit date, and we cease to hand our borders over to traffickers and crooks. And we cease to do another thing with our borders, which is we allow death to be border control. Think about all the people who die trekking through the Arizona desert. Think of all those kids drowning in the Aegean. This is the scandal that horrifies me from a human point of view. We've allowed death to be the border control, and we've allowed the crooks to take over migration control. And that's a terrible indictment. And what we need then to do is build back citizens' consent for regularized, decent, fair migration control, and I think we can do it. It also does require repatriation. There has to be tough love. People who violate the rules coming in have to be sent back. We have to be clear about that. But if we can get that balance, fairness combined with control, biometric identifiers for lawful migrants, so that they can surface and not be in the underground. I think we can reclaim borders, but also reclaim our honor. Thanks very much for listening. I go up here, and then you beat me up, right? That's right, okay.
So thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. I just want to say we are both Canadian, so that makes us not native, maybe invasive others, I don't know. In any case, the reason I'm saying this is that Michael was almost my prime minister, so it's a little intimidating being up here with him. So I just want to say, to start, as an anthropologist, it makes a lot of sense to me that one would take seriously what people are actually thinking and feeling on the ground, right? Not to lecture down to people, but to take their ethical commitments and belief systems seriously. Not to be patronizing, but actually to listen, to think about why they're reacting as they do, which I think is what your ordinary virtues perspective does. I do want to think about humanitarianism as a counterpoint, perhaps, to this. Because I see humanitarianism as entirely universalist. It's based on a belief in a universal humanity. It's based on the belief to alleviate human suffering wherever it's found, and particularly applied to distant strangers. It's a humanist perspective, but it is also driven by compassion, pity, and benevolence. I don't see it as at odds with moral universalism, but precisely the expression of moral universalism, and I do think it fails in the ways that you say it does. I mean, humanitarianism, again, as a form of universalism, is always accompanied by its opposite, by repression, by policing, by militarism. I think now in Europe, we have interesting examples because Frontex has its humanitarian wing, Mare Nostrum has its, which are these operations in the Mediterranean that are both kind of policing and militarized, and yet claim to be humanitarian because they save people at sea, right? We have in Calais the humanitarian container camps, which, in the name of helping people and aiding in their suffering, put people in shipping containers designed to contain goods. So this is an example, I think, of the slippages between people and other kinds of things, right? That suddenly people, who seem to be treated like things become just as things. They're treated as things. So again, thinking again of our Invasive Other conference today, but so I guess my thought is that, when I've been working with humanitarian organizations, they work encounter by encounter as well. And they, they also decide who is the right kind of victim or not, right? You have to perform in that encounter. If you don't, exactly as you said, you get denied. One is not recognized. In humanitarianism, help is also about a gift, not about the right. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as humanitarian rights yet, even though people are making the argument for it. So there's no right to aid, to help, to shelter, to food in these kinds of cases. So I guess my point is that even in universalist movements like humanitarianism, there is the discretionary power of these affective dimensions of benevolence. They're treated as a gift. So I guess, I would think that, I think people certainly do react this way, but I don't think it is about a failure of universalism or the fact that people don't understand universalism, but I think it's inherent to a politics based on humanity, which is always trying to figure out who is human and who is not quite human enough. So I think that ordinary ethics and humanitarianism in this way are not, or to ordinary virtue, are quite similar and don't actually, either of them address our current political situation. So, I feel like we don't have a language for this expansive inclusionary politics that I think what we would want. I I think we do need to come up with new languages or visions for political community, and even those of us who might be for open borders still recognize that we need a place to call home, we need a place to belong, we need a ground to stand on. So we need political community, we need a language for it, but I think the political languages we have right now are bankrupt. So, you know, in thinking about what ordinary people are doing and thinking about ordinary virtues, there's a lot of amazing people, as you were saying too, out there, and I think some of them might be drawing on these ordinary virtues and some on humanitarianism, but others I think are actually trying to forge new political communities themselves and new forms, new languages. And I think, for instance, of a thing called the Lampedusa Charter, which was put together by folks who on Lampedusa, you know, in a grassroots effort by these North African and European associations and movements and networks working together in response to the fact that 20,000 people had died just right outside their homes. And so the islanders reacted exactly as you said. They didn't want to stop people from coming. They welcomed people, but instead of reacting in that way, they put together a new political vision to protect migrants. They critiqued capitalist processes that had led to these deaths, and they questioned the distinction between European and non-Europeans. So this charter that they put together is planetary in scope, and they really urge us to see the Earth as a shared space. So I think there are actually movements out there maybe that aren't quite ordinary virtue, that are helping us imagine the world differently, helping to guide us in this process, as you said, of co-recognition. I wonder if we might use the words I think Bridget Anderson used earlier, which are about co-producers of our futures, not just co-recognizing, but putting together our futures. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that and speak to how you would see that alongside the ordinary virtues perspective.
That was extremely interesting, particularly the point about humanitarianism being, on the one hand, a form of universalism premised on common human identity, and then its extreme moral selectivity, victims having to perform and measure up, and some people getting the full spotlight gaze of humanitarian awareness, and others in complete cast into darkness and all that stuff. And there's a huge contradiction there. And the contradiction, it seems to me, is not hypocrisy. It's worse than that. It's deeper than that. Mm-hmm. That is, it's simply impossible for human beings to be equally concerned for all suffering human beings. As we speak tonight, you know, it's like, you know, a child is being beaten, you know, as we speak tonight. We don't know where, somewhere, and a child is being beaten. It's impossible for us to extend equal moral concern. And yet our moral principles ask that of us, and find the fact that we are concerned about this child being beaten but not that child being beaten is a reproach. And it should be a reproach in a sense. But there's something impossible about the demands of moral universalism, both in human rights and in humanitarianism. That seems to me to be right. One of the people who taught me most about this, I guess that's why I'm talking about it here, was Hannah Arendt. There's one of the things about her that I've learned all my life from is the section on human rights and the origins of totalitarianism written in 1948. I mean, one of the great things about this woman is she was a refugee. I mean, she knew what it was to be stateless. She knew what it was not to have a passport. She knew what it was to be stripped of her nationality. And it left her with an indelible feeling that the binary contrast between a citizen and stranger is morally fundamental. The minute you lose citizenship, the minute you're stripped of that, the minute you're stateless and homeless, you're in a situation of extreme vulnerability. And the entire weight of post-war international law, from the UDHR to the Refugee Convention or everything, was designed to give those folks who didn't have the rights of citizenship and constitutional protection something equivalent. And I guess one of the things I'm saying is that we're still on the road with that. We still draw a very strong distinction between citizens and strangers. The protection we give to strangers is minimal. It would be a scandal that would cause governments to fall in Italy if the people drowning off Lampedusa were Italian citizens. Large numbers of people can drown off Lampedusa. If they're not citizens, they don't signify, or they signify in some distant way. And that's just one of the things that Arendt insists that we look at and understand. And none of what I'm saying is designed to weaken or naysay the attempt we've made to give rights to those people in those inflatable dinghies and give obligations to us to protect them. But it's just observable that this isn't working terrifically well. And my second point is that when citizens look at this, they understand instinctively, they do a triage of duty. They have duties to citizens. They have duties to their family. It expands outwards. And by the time they get to strangers beyond their borders, we're in very remote, very abstract country. But it doesn't mean that it's we can describe this relationship as a uncaring one. What's very striking is citizens do construe duties to strangers, but they're not universalist in my view. They're just this person and that person and the next person. I guess, all my adult life I've been haunted by, Marx's 1844 manuscripts and the transformative idea of the species being, that beneath, all of you are different, all of you are individuals, all of you are absolutely individualized and specific, but beneath it all is a common species being that we call our own. But I just think that the ordinary virtue perspective says that what actually counts is all your differences, and that those differences are primary and the human identity is very secondary, and that's just, I don't want to construe anything as a natural, unbudgeable fact, but I'm just saying that's where we are now, and that's what you see when you talk about these issues in politics, and it's what you see when you talk to students. I mean, it's just, that's our situation. A big conflict between the moral claims of universalism and the highly individualized, highly particularized character of the way we see human beings. And so all this, modern discourse about how we're always othering other people, give me a break. They're other. They are other, And then it's a question of what we do about their otherness, but they're other. And that seems to me the human situation that Arendt, I think, saw more clearly almost than anybody else. And it's significant that she saw it because she was stateless, because she is the one great philosopher in the 20th century that I can think of who experienced radical fear. I mean, radical existential dread. Am I going to get across the frontier to Portugal or not, And that went into her bones. And that's why, I have such deep respect for her perspective. Sorry, I'm not even sure I answered. I went into a riff. No, I'm sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. I'll just say one more thing and then open it up to, I agree with you about Hannah Arendt seeing all of this well before, in such prescient ways. But she gave up on human rights entirely, right? She didn't believe in them because she felt precisely that this was a recipe for people being expelled, thank you, expulsé, expelled from the category of humanity, so that was not our basis for political or moral community. And you are obviously very clearly identifying a crisis in democratic consent. So what are the bases of our political communities? Where do we look for them? Where do you come? Again, they're going to be bottom up, or they're going to be top down. Richard Rorty in his arguments about human rights also believed that these were not universally held, but that they needed to be taught. It needed to be a pedagogy, that people need to learn to be civilized and so on. So I'm not sure, I don't think you're saying that, but where are we going to get this? How are we going to address populism? Is that the answer to the crisis of democratic consent?
Oh boy, it's such a, the crisis of democratic consent is playing out in the 2016 American context so vividly that I hesitate to go there. There's a whole lot wrong with our institutions. There's a whole lot wrong with who is, but I can't touch any of that. I can't touch the institutional structure because that's another conversation. But the question of how the virtues are cultivated, the question of how they are taught, how we learn them, I think is an urgent question for all of us as teachers. And it's the condition of, modernity that all of our teaching of the virtues and teaching of obligations and teaching of human rights is either critical or it's just ideology. So that the particular strain of I'm a great believer that it is my duty to cultivate the virtues as a teacher, so that just as that it is the duty of a pianist when he plays late Beethoven to teach us by the act. That's not what a pianist does. He doesn't teach. But when we say a pianist is a great pianist, we say we have learned perfect moral pitch from that person. That is, we come out of a concert thinking that is what pathos is. All talk is cheap, but that is pathos. In the same way that when we teach, we think, that's what tolerance is. That's what it is. And we want our students to think about that and then be extremely critical. My sense of the ordinary virtues perspective that is the result of a lot of kind of anthropology of ethics where I go around the world and talk and listen to people is that the good news is that ordinary virtues are anchored in the business of social life in ways that should be very reassuring to us. We simply can't get through the day as human beings. It is specific to us as the creatures we are, without offering justifications for what we do. I want you to think well of me, Miriam. I don't want you to think I'm a son of a gun, And I want to justify what I've been arguing tonight to you. And I want to go out in the night with you thinking, well, we disagree about this and that, but I've offered justifications to you and you've offered justifications to me. And that's how we live. And it's the ethical dimension of what we do and the virtues dimension is not a kind of accidental add-on. It is constitutive. It's the business of everyday life. And you see that reproduced everywhere. You see it reproduced not just in university settings. I was in squatter camps in South Africa before Christmas, and you see folks constructing moral lives in situations of utter abjection because it's bad enough, right, their poverty. It would be an awful lot worse if it was a total jungle, right? So they do reproduce ordinary virtue and ordinary life. And so I feel kind of, and then to complete the thought, I'm not using ordinary virtue to question or cast doubt on the validity of the universals. I'm doing something different. I'm trying to say ordinary virtue, which is selective, particular, individualized, and often unfair and limited, ought to face the burden of justification before universal claims all the time. The local ought to be justifying to the universal to the local, and back and forth. And that is how we live morally. I know I'm partial, but, I know I shouldn't think this, but. That struggle of justification is when ordinary virtue is under the pressure of the universal obligations that we have put out. And it's that struggle that makes us moral beings. So it's not to say, throw human rights out, throw the Refugee Convention out, but understand how deeply counterintuitive a lot of universalism is as a practical political matter on the ground. And let's then get these two in more honest dialogue with each other. And out of that dialogue comes education, comes change to the ordinary virtues, and perhaps some change to the universals as well.
Okay, thanks. The only thing I will say to that is that I totally agree with you, but I actually see those locals fighting it out on the ground already, and that there are incredibly important political movements that are challenging those other sentiments. I think that's out there with the kind of the Lampedusa and so others, and many other of the undocumented movements. I think we will open it up now to questions. David, and then Bridget. Yeah.
I guess I go first because I got the microphone first. Thank you very much. Am I not first?
No, it's fine. Go ahead. I just wanted to single the second person in line, that's all.
I see, thank you. Thank you very much for a really deeply moving and thought-provoking talk. I want to make 2 points. The first is that I think that the place where your argument for otherness really does work is at the level of vulnerability, because, of course, the one distinguishing difference is that when we go below the political to the community, within the community we have diversity, and the diversity can be divided into people who have community and people who don't, and the most vulnerable are people who live in communities who don't have community rights. So they have no social capital whatsoever. And thinking about the cup half full version of this is that I think what happens in the domain of what you call ordinary virtue is that on the ground people in communities recognize that level of inequality and otherness that is a part of daily living, and that some people have voice in communities and other people don't have voice. So I wholly agree with the distinction and the presence of otherness, as it were, at the level of vulnerability. The second point I want to make is that as I listened to you as an anthropologist, of course, the literature on dynamic reciprocity and exchange is a very old one in our field. And when you talk about the dynamic amelioration of difference, which is the way I would, in my own way, summarize what I took away from your notion of ordinary virtue, this is a place where opposites are ameliorated and merged in an attempt to create something new. And that is a definition of creativity. And I'm wondering the extent to which looking at the cup half full is really made possible by thinking of human reciprocity as a creative enterprise. I mean, the great Baroque artist Bernini once said that the thing about the great work of art is not to create something beautiful, but take the gnawing difference and turn it into the centerpiece, so much so that without it, the work of art couldn't have existed. I think that maybe what happens at the level of ordinary virtue is that people are attempting to create, and where that isn't possible, that process, because it is dynamic, it's actually thermodynamic, where hot and cold, as it were, are somehow ameliorated, and that energy creates something new and different. So I wonder if a way of looking at this isn't to think about it potentially at the level of creativity rather than perhaps a universal or a local one.
I thought that was an extremely interesting remark, because I think it highlighted the static character of my dichotomy between citizen and stranger, and the static character of the relationships between stateless persons and citizens in the ordinary virtue relation. And what you're saying, and you see it all over Germany right now, is people being changed by the interaction. The dynamic quality of the interaction. Otherness remains, but it's reconfigured, it's redefined. You know, he's still Assyrian, I'm still German, he's still Muslim, I'm still whatever I am, or she. But everybody comes out of, when these things work, and I say yes to you on condition that you say yes to me, the yeses begin to change. What you affirm begins to change. I think you're capturing the dynamism of this, and that ends up being a much more hopeful story. Everybody's changed by these things. Germany will be changed. Individuals one by one are being changed. And this dynamic interaction, I think you've caught, and I don't think it's in my language yet. So it was a very helpful suggestion. Thank you.
So there's one there and one there. Bridget was
Yeah, thank you. I've got 2 points as well, or 2 questions. One is to go back to the child that's being beaten and the one that you do care about and the one that you don't care about. And to say, well, but maybe the one that you do care about is the one that you have some kind of connection with. Maybe that you happen to see, that's in neighbours, or that, you know, isn't in the next town, that you've no idea what their name is. And so then in terms of asylum as a gift or a right, I mean, I've got all sorts of problems with asylum, so I'm quite surprised to hear myself trying to speak up for it. But, I mean, isn't one of the problems with your analogy that actually the host did bomb the guest's house? So the host then saying, well, this is my gift to you, the guest, that you can come and stay, is a little bit of a cheek. You know? So I suppose it's about recognizing that connection, that there are connections, and that, that those matter, and that actually it's about kind of, that very often it's about uncovering those connections. So in terms of when we're talking about education, that I would see I would see that kind of education maybe as important. So maybe if you could speak to that. And then the second is to kind of push you a bit on what Miriam was saying about the importance of kind of imagining new ways of political community. And to say, well, so when we hear about citizens have to have priority, and that is the basic kind of logic of citizenship, I think, and certainly it gets pulled out, it's getting pulled out quite a lot now. And one of the things that I'm always surprised at coming from the UK is that basically you have this whole discussion about the white working class not liking migrants, and actually, you know, the white working class being kind of denied access to services and so on because of migrants, from people who actually never talk about the white working class and their rights until you talk about immigration, when suddenly they really care about the white working class. And my reason for raising this is that I wanted to ask, well, isn't there an assumption that actually citizenship is working for citizens, is working equally for all citizens, whereas actually, you know, as we've seen in Greece, and certainly with the politics of austerity, you know, citizens in the UK, we have citizens with kwashiorkor. You know, we actually have malnutrition. So it's not necessarily working for citizens either. So that, to me, suggests there is an urgency about these new forms of political community. And it seems to me that the question then is, well, how can we address policymakers about this issue, given that actually they are constrained within the sort of ideal of the nation state? Sorry, a bit of a long question.
Those are extremely important points. No, citizenship is not working for citizens. Tremendous amounts of exclusion and denial in the civic community. The problem is that then makes the practice of generosity to strangers often more difficult than less. So that's one issue. New forms of political community and organizing, certainly, absolutely. The and the second point about, well, we bombed their house, I think is certainly true. But I'm very struck when I talk to, in the kind of ethnography of what do you think about refugees and what do you think about Syrians, that it's unquestionably true that U.S. and allied follies in Iraq and afterward have been crucial drivers in this particular refugee flow. There's not even an interesting discussion, clear. But if you ask Western Europeans why they might take in some refugees, the sense that they have strategic responsibility for the flow is not a prominent feature of their analysis. And telling them we ought to take them in because we wrecked their country is true, but it has zero traction or impact. So there's a kind of lack of fit between your analysis, was 100% right. I mean, every time I give a thing about Syrian refugees, I talk about the drivers, and one of the drivers is 2003. There's no question about it. But this is another place where the division, thinking about how ordinary virtue construes this can be illuminating, because telling people that you ought to take people because you bombed their house, unconvincing and unpersuasive and uninteresting to them, by and large. I mean, I say that to challenge, and I could be absolutely wrong. It's just never worked for me. Maybe that's all I'm saying. But your point about citizenship, your second point about citizenship not working is crucial. And also the abyss of difference between, elites, in whom I class myself, and this supposed white working class is another problem. The social divide is just enormous. And the ease with which, the shameful ease with which we categorize the white working class as racist is a disgrace. I mean, it's a moral disgrace to me. Anyway.
Thank you. I do want to also, along with others, thank you for the clarity that you've brought to some of the discussions that we've had. But I wanted to get back to this distinction that you made between the elite virtues and the ordinary virtues, as you called them, and ask, especially in light of the Trumpian masses that we now have paraded across newspapers and television shows in this country, who seem to represent what I think many of us in this room certainly, and probably many across the country, would see as not so virtuous virtues being used in terms of both refugees and also other aspects of ordinary society, which actually, as a literary analogy, is very much like the beginning of Sense and Sensibility, where you move from high ideals to essentially inaction. I wanted to ask you how, in your framework that you're proposing potentially in this new book, you deal with the issue of correcting what you see as ordinary virtues that are not ethically proper. And it's unfortunate, Arian knows this, that the chair of the philosophy department here at the New School, Alice Crary, is not here. She just wrote a book called Inside Ethics, which deals with how you get from utilitarianism, Kantianism. I love the fact that you're from Harvard, America's cathedral of Kantianism. I'm very curious how you propose addressing this.
No. I don't, when I call it the ordinary virtue perspective, not to give it any alibis. I mean, I think that's right. And there's nothing holy and above reproach simply because it's local, authentic, and especially working class. I mean, all of that just won't fly, and we know it won't fly. And I think my earlier exchange with Miriam about this sense of a necessary dialogue between what I'm calling ordinary virtue and universalist claims is essential, and sometimes it'll be critical. And it's especially important politically. If you just take, I can't correct all the vices of the ordinary virtue perspective in one go and one try, and I'm sure I'd just lay myself open to ridicule. But when you look at the public opinion and polls on just one issue, the issue of taking in refugees, it's what is absolutely fascinating to me about this is that from 1938, from the Jewish refugee question, should we take Jewish refugees in 1938, the Gallup poll numbers are 68% don't. You go to the Hungarian refugees of 1956, 60% said don't take anybody. Despite the fact that one of the most wonderful moments in American popular art, to me, this is a completely irrelevant aside, but is Elvis Presley getting up on the Ed Sullivan Show in early 1958 and singing "There Will Be Peace in the Valley" on behalf of Hungarian refugees. It's a kind of amazing moment. I think Colonel Parker thought it would be good for Elvis to be associated with a humanitarian cause. So Elvis, who is a consummate artist and a consummate master of gospel music, sang "There Will Be Peace in the Valley" to urge Americans to be more generous towards Hungarian refugees. You think, could we ever get back there? Right? Sorry, normal service is now resumed. You then look at the Vietnamese refugees in the 70s, again, unpopular. What's interesting is retrospectively, all of these causes are viewed very, very differently. And that suggests a kind of dialogue with a political dialogue is crucial. I don't want to fetishize political leadership, and God knows, having tried to be a political leader and understood how bloody difficult it is, I don't want to overdo this, but I do think in the dialogue within ordinary virtue, you don't want to take it as given and read. You want to work with it, and in the circumstances where America has done the right thing on refugees, it's always required someone getting way out ahead of the public, way out ahead of the numbers. And right now, the president won't do it. He's got a window between November and January where you can get way out ahead of the numbers. So the numbers are very adverse on Syrians, for example, 58, 40 or something against taking refugees. And some of that is anchored in what I would call the vices of ordinary virtue. You know, they're strangers, we can't, you know, they're Muslims, I'm okay where I am, we got enough problems, we can't afford to, I'm hurting, why should we, all that stuff, right? And you just have to have someone, here's a thundering cliche, but you do need to get someone to appeal to the better angels of our nature. It's just constitutive of democratic politics. And we don't have it often enough. And maybe that is why I referred to Elvis Presley. You listen to that, you can Google it and find it. You hear for about a minute and a half Elvis Presley, God bless him wherever he is, appealing to the better angels of our nature, in one of the most authentic moral traditions of American life, which is the gospel. Well, there you go.
Did you want to add?
No. May I? Thank you for your talk, and thank you for the clarity of it. There's something that's kind of disturbing me, many things disturbing me, and I'll play devil's advocate here. As if the world that we're inhabiting, you're just holding in abeyance the politics of control, the security state, and enormous investments that citizens should think of themselves as privileged, as Bridget brought up, that those who are not, that there should be the other in this form. We know a history in which all of those others, at different moments when it was convenient, when labor demand was at certain heights or not, that they are no longer considered other, but become the internal enemy within. I'm concerned at it's almost Pollyannish, the way in which you're holding everything still. He says, well, this is the real politique, I'm sorry, but this is the way it is. Tolerance itself is a form of subordination. Tolerance itself already has so many attributes tied to it that to start as if tolerance was a good is very disturbing to me, in the same way that your use, just the very place you started with, was these ordinary virtues of these ordinary people are pity and compassion. We have a history that you know as well as I do of a politics of pity, of a politics of sympathy and compassion that have been part of every imperial project all the way through. So I'm perplexed by, I see that, I'm glad someone is imagining a world that's better, and I know you are, and I really am appreciating that. I'm not saying that ironically, but I don't understand how you can imagine that given the enormous investments in ensuring certain inequalities in certain ways that are perpetuated. They're not just sitting there in a holding ground. They are being reasserted over and over and again. To put that outside of your narrative seems to me it weakens it in so many ways.
That's a strong challenge. I think it's the first time in a long and happy life I've been accused of being Pollyannish. I'm going to go out into the night absolutely rejoicing because I'm usually so damn gloomy. People can't believe it. So I'm delighted you think I'm being much too optimistic. What I would come back at you at is that this stuff about ordinary virtue is based on field work. I sat in a lot of funny places for the last 3 years, in Myanmar, in Brazil, in South America, South Africa.
Well, I should have said I'm an anthropologist.
Yeah. And maybe this is the sin of what the Marxists used to denounce as voluntarism and individualism, but I just think, the coercive discourses are ceaselessly reproduced by that wicked thing, neoliberalism, whatever the hell that is. People exist in discursive fields that are structured by dominant interests, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want to read that out of the analysis at all, but the people I talk to on the ground believe, poor pathetic souls, that they are agents, human agents, responsible for their conduct. And they want to think of themselves as such, and they want to think their moral action, for better or for worse, is the action of individually responsible moral agents. And they know they live in discursive fields that are coercive, and people are telling them what to think day and night. But the best of them don't give a shit. They want to live a life that is fashioned by themselves as best they can. And that is a constitutive part of the ordinary virtues that I saw. And much of my hope for the future is contingent on my experience of that, on the desire of human agents in the field force that you very well describe to remain responsible moral agents. And so we probably just disagree methodologically about how the world is, but that is what I think I see out there.
One more question? We have one more question, maybe? Just, no, to Larry.
I think my question was taken care of.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Sorry. Okay. Maybe if you want, we can
There's
take.
one at the back there.
We can, maybe how about we take three, people just say what they're going to say, and then Michael can ask, we'll collect them, and then he can respond however he wants or not respond.
I wanted to offer the idea that we're actually not all equal. And in fact, this is my step stool right here that I brought, that I carry with me on my person, on my individual, because I am navigating spaces, for example, and it's not about me, my ego's not here, I'm just saying that this is, so we're not all equal, and there is a kind of productive process of I think, making the individual that maybe is perhaps out of, I know you mentioned you're a privileged person, and then you went into these other spaces and you're kind of gathering a kind of sentiment. But there's a production process there, and I think it's important to know perhaps that I don't think empathy is the thing that's taught, or the thing that you mentioned earlier, effective politics or effective dynamic, effective dimensions. And I think I don't think it's surprising if communities kind of band together out of a common political climate or structure. I think, I don't think empathy, I know you didn't mention the word empathy, but I think that kind of collectivism that we were talking about, that kind of, helping each other, maybe the kind of ordinary virtues, I don't think that might be about education or about, or even if it's top down and or bottom up. I don't even think that's part of the, I think that may be something in the, I hesitate to say the nature of humanness. I'm going to put that in quotation marks because I'm going to question myself after. But also the concept of dependency. I don't have a question here. I just wanted to offer these words to kind of broaden the discourse, because in that mode of the guest and the host, there is a dependency there. The gift versus the, there's a dependency that is important because it's about power. So I just wanted to offer those concepts there.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
We're just going to collect two more questions, and then so Emmanuel at the back, and then Larry.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I had more of a question regarding what do you mean by universal values? What universal means to you? Because my concern is that we go back to actual Western Christian tradition and values. I mean, Samuel Moyne and Marion Young have showcased how the idea of human rights, universal human rights, actually come from Christianity or from an idea that is white, male, and bourgeois. So obviously, there is a problem with when we go back to universal, actually we are being particularistic and Western and imposing a view on others. And but even when you mention like Marx, I mean, his species being concept was actually against Feuerbach. He wanted to take into the individual in a particular socioeconomic historical moment. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, and then Larry, right here.
In some ways, it follows from that question, or those observations. I'm an anthropologist, but I actually reformed in my later years. And the thing that struck me is that, at least, that I didn't get much sense that where the ordinary virtues come from was playing a big role in your discussion. And there's a funny way in which universalism almost can be reversed from the way you're discussing it, because there's a great deal of work now that suggests that moral reasoning follows a fairly stable pattern across traditions and across these variations, and that much of what you were talking about in terms of moral, in terms of the local virtues, are actually reflect that. They're very consistent with a universal psychological predilection to think certain ways about moral dilemmas. And one of the ways that they also cast these, that you sort of reject, is in a way that's perfectly consistent with racism in systems in which race plays an important role in organizing power and authority. There are other kinds of similar things to racism, but that exist in other social settings. But that also seems to be a powerfully and deeply embedded and endogenous tradition to the human psyche. So that your concern to sort of distance some of the less attractive side of these local traditions from racism, I think, is unfortunate and risky, because it really does seem to drive an awful lot of of the way that people think about it. And it's one of the things that allows us to very easily calibrate where the line between who's deserving of rightful treatment and who isn't. Whereas one other observation, the notion of this elite system of thought about morality that's a universalist one, which I would argue probably isn't in any case, but it's in line with what was just said, but it makes it sound a little like the relationship between folk expectations about the interaction of physical objects and physics, right? That is, you have this well-developed system that grew out of the local system of knowledge that now really surpasses it in many ways, and it has special virtues because of that. I'm not sure that there's actually much relationship between what you would like to see a moral universalism bring with it, and what people's local moral traditions are like. It's not something that's going to be taught very easily. Actually, it's unlike. Final thing. Yeah, no. The one, just, we get the moral systems we want, and we want these limited moral systems. If you, well.
Okay.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Boy, oh boy. I do want to say, because it's kind of my last word, how much I owe to all of you. I mean, I don't have good answers to some of this stuff. And I was listening hard to everything I was told, and I will have to go away and think about a lot of it. I don't know what to do about all this Western Christian white stuff. I mean, you know, the thing I usually say about that in answer, because I get sort of impatient with it in a way, is it assumes that human rights is then the reliable instrument of domination for the cultures and civilizations from which it comes, when in fact it's always struck me that the reason that human rights has globalized, yes, it was the handmaiden of imperialism and capitalism and that wonderful thing called neoliberalism, which again I don't understand, but the thing about human rights that I see observationally on the ground is that it has been recurrently a language for emancipation from empire, from colonialism, from domination, and from alien rule. So it has this kind of polyvalence, at least, which seems to me has to be understood in the history of what's happened since the Second World War. It was the language that decolonized Africa and Asia, basically, and that's important to our story. But to the degree that it has become a universal sociologically, it's become universal because it articulated people's demands for freedom right around the world, freedom from a lot of white Christian dominators. So that's kind of one thing I would say, and it doesn't make me blind to some of the things about human rights that are just wrong and disrespectful of cultures and all that stuff. I get all that, but I don't think the idea that human rights is invalidated because it's Western Christian white actually understands the history of the last 80 years of human rights. The very good question about kind of where do ordinary virtues come from, you were kind of flipping my contrast between the universal and local around and saying, actually, there's plenty of universal in the local, in the sense that, and I think that's something that confirmed by I would dignify if I called it field work, because you're a professional anthropologist, you do real field work, but I kind of did field work. And the thing I saw was that certain virtues have a kind of universality because every place and situation and context I was in, people felt they had to give reasons. They had to give justifications of a moral kind to what they were doing. I mean, it was just, it's not, and some of those are self-deceiving, some of those are downright lies, but it's integral to the business of being a human being to provide a justification which construes you as a virtuous person or as a person doing the best you can in a certain situation. There is something universal about that, and it comes out of the human situation, and it's reliably reproduced. I'm calling it ordinary virtues, actually not in the kind of pat ordinary people on the head sense. It actually emerged because one of my teachers that I loved and revered was called Judith Sklar, and she wrote a wonderful book called Ordinary Vices. So I'm kind of just, it's just a kind of complicated homage to Dita Sklar. But it is also secondarily a contrast with extraordinary virtue. To elucidate that, it's the contrast between the extraordinary virtue of the operators inside the damaged Fukushima reactor in 2011, who displayed a courage that extraordinary to try and save the thing and prevent it from blowing, and the ordinary virtue of the people evacuated from those exclusion zones who had to display just kind of resilience of an ordinary kind to get through it. And so that was the contrast, rather than, I hope, and my point about human rights being an elite discourse was simply that it is an official discourse of states and governments and NGOs and professionals in the field. But I was also assuming that the ordinary virtues I'm also talking about are also the property of people who are privileged, your word earlier. So that's kind of where I'm going. And I certainly, to go back to a question earlier, don't want to give ordinary virtues a kind of alibi and a pass and exalt them against these alien elite discourses. I don't want to get into a kind of weirdo populism at all. I just want to understand where the ordinary virtues come from, the constitutive role they play in the reproduction of social life, and my particular interest as a politician is the problem they pose when political leaders want to defend certain universalist obligations that run up against particularist and local commitments and understand that more deeply, which is what I was trying to do tonight. But I do want to thank you again for let me think aloud about this, because the concrete is not set. You know, I'm still pouring concrete. Anybody who's written a book knows, you know, it's still moving around. So this was an extremely helpful occasion for me, and I thank you for being here, and I thank Miriam, and thank Arian, and thank the dean, and thank the new school, and thank you all.
But thank you to Michael. Thank you so much.
That was an interesting discussion. You got some good colleagues.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to work these things through.
Yeah. I'd like to know about this Lampedusa charter. I didn't know about, or I've heard about it, but I haven't tracked it down. Can I find it online or something? Would you send me the link? Thank you.